August is a strange month for a lawn. The worst of it might already be behind you, or it might still be sitting right in front of you depending on where you live. But either way, this is the month where a handful of small things either get handled properly or turn into much bigger problems by the time fall actually arrives. None of what I am about to walk you through requires expensive equipment or a full weekend of work. It is mostly about paying attention to a few specific things while there is still time to act on them. A lot of people treat August as a quiet, forgettable stretch sandwiched between the panic of July heat and the busier work of September, and that assumption is exactly what lets a few small, fixable problems turn into much bigger ones by the time cooler weather actually shows up. Quick note before we get into it, since this is exactly the kind of thing people ask me about constantly. If you are tired of guessing what your lawn actually needs at each point in the year, I wrote a short ebook that walks you through your specific grass type, month by month, so you always know exactly what to do and when. Scan the QR code on screen or check the link in the description if you want a copy. Now, let's get into what August actually asks of you. Start with water, because August is often the single driest, hottest stretch of the entire year in a lot of the country, even after the calendar technically moves past the peak of summer. This is not the month to ease off a good watering routine just because you feel like you have already made it through the worst of the heat. A lot of people mentally check out of careful watering once July ends, treating August as a kind of victory lap, when in plenty of regions it is actually the driest month on record rather than a gentle wind down from summer. Keep watering deeply and infrequently, rather than a little bit every evening, aiming for somewhere around 1 to 1.5 inches of water a week, including whatever rain actually falls, delivered in 1 or 2 long sessions rather than a handful of short ones. Early morning, somewhere between 4 and 9, is still the right window, since it gives water time to soak down before the heat of the day pulls it back out through evaporation, and it lets the grass dry off before nightfall instead of sitting wet in the dark, which is exactly the setup fungal disease looks for. Late evening watering feels like a reasonable alternative on paper, especially if mornings are busy, but it leaves the lawn sitting wet for 10 or more hours overnight, which is exactly the stretch of time diseases like brown patch and dollar spot need to actually take hold in a stressed summer lawn. If you are not sure whether your system is actually delivering that target amount, set a few empty cans around the yard, run a zone for 15 minutes, and measure what lands in each one. That single check tells you exactly how long to run each zone to hit the number your lawn actually needs, instead of guessing based on how long it feels like you have been standing there holding a hose. It is also worth resisting the urge to panic water once a section starts looking a bit rough, since cranking the timer up in response usually backfires. Soil that stays soggy too long pushes oxygen out of the root zone, inviting disease at the exact moment the lawn is least able to fight it off, and it keeps roots sitting shallow instead of encouraging them to grow deeper in search of moisture the way a proper deep soak actually does. Since disease pressure keeps coming up, it is worth spending a moment on brown patch specifically, since August humidity is exactly the kind of environment this fungus waits for. Brown patch activates once nighttime temperatures hold above roughly 70 degrees for several nights in a row, combined with humidity that keeps grass blades wet well into the night, and once it takes hold, a healthy section of lawn can go from fine to bare, thin turf in about a week. The classic sign is a roughly circular patch, sometimes with a slightly darker, smoke-colored ring around the edge while conditions are actively wet, and it tends to hit the lushest, most heavily watered or fertilized sections of a lawn hardest, since dense growth holds moisture against the blade surface longer than a leaner stand of grass does. A preventative fungicide built around propiconazole, applied once with a hose-end sprayer at the label rate right as those overnight temperatures start crossing the threshold, generally costs very little and covers a lawn through the riskiest stretch of the season, working out to be far cheaper and more effective than trying to treat the damage after visible patches have already shown up. Checking the overnight low in your local forecast for a few nights running is really all it takes to know whether this window has opened up for your specific yard. Dry, sun-baked patches are also worth a closer look for a completely different reason this time of year, since spider mites thrive in exactly the hot, dry conditions August tends to deliver, and drought-stressed turf is particularly prone to an infestation taking hold. Unlike chinch bugs, mite damage tends to show up first along slopes, near foundations, driveways, or other hardscaping that radiates extra heat, often appearing as irregular, straw-colored patches that stay dry-looking even in an otherwise well-watered lawn. Because these mites are barely visible to the naked eye, the easiest way to confirm them is holding a plain sheet of white paper under the affected grass, giving the blades a firm shake, and looking closely at what lands on the paper. Live mites show up as tiny specks that are actually moving, and smearing one across the paper typically leaves a faint reddish streak behind, confirming what you are dealing with rather than guessing. The frustrating part of mite damage is that it tends to persist visually even after the mites themselves are gone, so a patch that looks freshly damaged might actually reflect an infestation that already ran its course days or weeks earlier. Consistent, proper deep watering is genuinely one of the better preventative tools here, since mite populations struggle to establish on turf that is not already running dry and stressed, which ties this pest directly back to the very first thing covered in this video. While you are paying closer attention to the lawn this month, this is also a good time to watch for chinch bugs if you are growing a warm season grass like St. Augustine, zoysia, centipede, or Bermuda, since late June through September is their peak activity window, and most homeowners start noticing real, visible damage right around the beginning of August. Chinch bugs are small, sap-sucking insects that inject a toxin into the grass blade as they feed, cutting off the plant's ability to move water properly, which causes the blade to yellow and die. The insect then simply moves to the next blade over, so the damage spreads outward from wherever the population first took hold, usually in the hottest, sunniest parts of the yard, often along driveways or sidewalks where reflected heat pushes soil and air temperature even higher than the rest of the lawn. St. Augustine grass is by far the most commonly affected, with populations sometimes climbing well past 100 per square foot in an untreated lawn during the peak of summer, though zoysia, centipede, and Bermuda can all host smaller outbreaks as well. At a glance, this looks a lot like ordinary drought stress, but there is one reliable way to tell the difference. Drought-stressed grass greens back up once it actually gets enough water. Chinch bug damage does not, since the crown and roots underneath a badly damaged patch are already dead by that point, and no amount of extra watering brings dead turf back to life. This distinction matters a lot in practice, since plenty of homeowners respond to early chinch bug damage by simply increasing how much they water that spot, assuming drought is the culprit, only to watch the patch keep spreading regardless of how much water goes down, wasting weeks that could have gone toward an actual treatment instead. If you suspect chinch bugs, cut both ends out of an empty coffee can, push it 2 to 3 inches into the soil right at the edge of a damaged patch, fill it with water, and wait 5 to 10 minutes. If chinch bugs are present, they will float to the surface where you can actually see and count them. Finding somewhere around 20 or more in a single test is generally considered the threshold where treatment is worth doing. It helps to check the edges of a damaged patch rather than the dead center, since that is usually where the live, actively feeding population is concentrated, with the middle of an older patch often already emptied out as the insects move outward looking for fresh grass to feed on. One detail worth remembering here too, heavy nitrogen fertilizing through summer actually works against you with this particular pest, since it builds up exactly the kind of thick thatch layer chinch bugs like to hide and lay eggs in, which is one more reason to hold off on nitrogen through the hottest stretch of the year rather than feeding a lawn that is already fighting through peak heat. Grubs deserve another look this month too, not because anything has changed since earlier in the summer, but because August sits right in the middle of the exact window where a curative treatment still actually works. Turf specialists sometimes describe this stretch as the last realistic chance to catch a grub population before biology takes the decision out of your hands entirely, since no amount of product applied later in the season reaches larvae that have already dropped several inches deeper into the soil profile. These are the young, actively feeding larvae hatched from eggs laid a few weeks earlier, still small and still sitting close enough to the surface for an insecticide to reach them. Japanese beetle grubs, European chafers, and masked chafers all follow roughly the same one-year life cycle, and by August most of them have grown large enough to cause noticeable root damage while still being shallow enough in the soil to actually treat effectively. Once soil temperatures drop later in fall, typically once they fall below around 50 degrees, grubs stop feeding and burrow much deeper into the soil to spend the winter, and at that point a surface-applied product has almost no way of reaching them at all. If you have noticed spongy patches that lift like a loose piece of carpet, or you have seen more birds or skunks digging around the yard than usual, cutting a 1-foot section of turf and counting what turns up underneath tells you whether the population has actually crossed the point where treatment makes sense, generally somewhere around 5 or more grubs per square foot. Beneficial nematodes are worth mentioning here too, since they offer a low toxicity option that specifically targets grubs in the soil while leaving most other organisms alone, and August timing works well for them too, since they need the same actively feeding, near-surface grubs that a synthetic insecticide is also targeting during this window. August is genuinely one of the better months to catch this before the window closes for the year, and catching pest problems on the right side of that calendar, instead of after the treatment window has already shut, is exactly the kind of timing the ebook I put together walks you through for your specific region. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want to check it out. Crabgrass is doing something specific this month too, and it is worth understanding even if you never touched a bottle of pre-emergent back in spring. By August, most crabgrass plants are mature and starting to produce seed heads, and a single plant left alone through this stretch can drop well over 100,000 seeds into the soil before the season ends. You do not actually need to kill the plant itself at this point, since crabgrass is an annual grass that dies completely on its own the moment the first hard frost hits. What you do need to prevent is that seed drop, since those seeds are exactly what creates next year's crop, sitting dormant in the soil all winter and germinating again as soon as conditions turn favorable in spring. Crabgrass tends to stand out visually once it reaches this stage too, spreading low and outward in a lighter, almost yellowish green compared to the surrounding turf, which makes late summer one of the easier times of year to actually spot every patch before it finishes seeding. The simple fix is mowing regularly through this stretch and bagging the clippings specifically from any crabgrass-heavy areas instead of leaving them down the way you normally would, since those clippings are loaded with viable seed at this point in the season. A lawn that gets this handled in August genuinely starts next spring with a noticeably smaller crabgrass problem than one that let every plant mature and scatter seed undisturbed right through fall. This same logic applies to other summer annual weeds beyond just crabgrass too, since spurge, foxtail, and goosegrass all follow a similar pattern of maturing and setting seed in late summer, so a walk around the yard specifically looking for seed heads on any of these, not just crabgrass, catches a broader share of next year's weed pressure before it ever has the chance to establish. It is also worth knowing that mowing alone will not fully stop seed production, since crabgrass grows low enough to the ground that it can still form seed heads even under a blade set at a normal healthy height, which is exactly why catching and bagging those seed heads specifically, rather than assuming a routine mow handles it automatically, matters so much this time of year. Getting a handle on which weeds are worth fighting now versus which ones are simply going to die off on their own with the first frost is exactly the kind of seasonal judgment call the ebook I put together walks you through. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want a copy. Mowing height and blade condition are worth a check this month as well, even though neither one is a new topic if you have been paying attention since early summer. Growth naturally starts to slow a little as August wears on, especially once nights begin cooling even slightly. So this is a reasonable point to start paying attention to whether your lawn actually needs cutting on the same fixed schedule you have been running all summer, rather than mowing out of habit regardless of how much the grass has actually grown. Keep cool season grass in the 3 to 4 inch range and stick to the 1/3 rule, never removing more than 1/3 of the blade length in a single pass. If you have not sharpened your mower blade since early summer, this is a good point in the season to do it again, since a dull blade tears rather than cuts, and that torn tissue loses moisture faster and opens the door to disease exactly when the lawn can least afford either problem. A quick way to check without any special tools is looking closely at the cut tips of the grass a day after mowing. A clean cut looks crisp and green straight across, while a ragged, torn edge that has already started browning is a clear sign the blade needs attention. Most mowers only need this done once or twice a season, so if you have already sharpened once back in spring, a midsummer touch-up now keeps the lawn in good shape through whatever growth is left before things slow down for fall. It is also worth paying attention to how quickly the grass is actually growing back between cuts, rather than sticking rigidly to whatever schedule you settled into back in June. A lawn that needed mowing every 5 days during peak spring growth might genuinely only need it every 7 to 10 days once the heat of August starts to tell growth to slow down, and mowing on the old schedule regardless adds unnecessary stress and wear to a plant that would rather be left alone for a few extra days. Nitrogen is still off the table for cool season grass through most of August in anywhere still running warm daytime temperatures, for the same reason it has been off the table since the middle of summer. Forcing new leaf growth on a plant that is still working to survive heat stress burns through energy reserves it needs for the rest of the season, and that tender new growth is also more vulnerable to disease in hot, humid conditions. Warm season grasses handle this differently since they are actively growing rather than fighting the heat, and a light August feeding is generally fine for something like Bermuda or Zoysia, as long as temperatures have not pushed into the extreme range. But even those grasses run into real burn risk once things climb above roughly 90 degrees. So the same basic caution still applies across the board during the hottest stretch of the month. If you are genuinely unsure whether your lawn could use a boost of color without the growth risk that comes with nitrogen, a light application of iron works as a reasonable substitute during this stretch, since it feeds chlorophyll production directly, rather than forcing new leaf growth, giving you a noticeably greener lawn without asking a heat-stressed plant to grow faster than it can currently support. If your daytime temperatures have already started easing down into a more moderate range by late August, that is a reasonable signal that the lawn is getting closer to its fall growth window. But jumping the gun during a stretch that is still genuinely hot works against you rather than for you. Finally, August is a good month to start getting ready for the work that actually needs to happen in September, even if you are not doing any of it quite yet. A simple soil test now tells you where your pH actually stands, with enough time to apply lime if you need it before winter, since lime is slow to react and benefits enormously from every extra week it gets before the ground freezes. If you know certain patches of the lawn are going to need overseeding this fall, picking up seed now means you are not scrambling to find the right blend once that narrow window actually opens, and the same goes for any fall broadleaf herbicide you plan on using, since buying it now means you are not stuck waiting on a shipment or hunting through a picked-over shelf right when the ideal application window actually arrives. None of this needs to happen this exact week, but having it lined up ahead of time means you are ready to move the moment conditions are actually right, rather than losing days of a short window just getting organized after the fact. Even something as simple as checking your mower deck, your sprayer, and your spreader for basic maintenance now means none of that equipment fails on you right when you actually need it working reliably a few weeks from now. It is also worth taking a slow walk around the whole property sometime this month, simply noting which areas struggled the most through summer, whether that was a slope that dried out faster than the rest of the yard, a shaded corner that never quite filled in, or a section along the driveway that seemed to take the worst of the heat. Writing down a quick list while the problems are fresh and visible saves you from trying to remember exactly where things went wrong once September's busier task list is already underway, and it gives you a much more targeted starting point for where to focus overseeding, soil correction, or any pest treatment once the actual work begins. So to pull all of this together, keep watering deeply and on schedule even once the calendar feels like it should be easing up. Watch overnight temperatures for the brown patch window, and treat preventatively rather than reactively. Check for chinch bugs if you are running a warm season lawn and the damage does not green back up after watering. Keep an eye on dry, sun-baked patches for spider mites using nothing more than a sheet of white paper. Keep an eye on grub activity while they are still shallow enough to treat, mow, and bag crabgrass clippings now, so this year's plants do not seed next year's problem. Stay off nitrogen until temperatures genuinely start easing. Keep your mower blade sharp and your height appropriate for the slower growth this time of year brings. And use whatever spare time you have this month getting ready for the work September actually demands. None of these individually takes more than a few minutes to check on, but skipping several of them at once is exactly how a lawn that looked fine through most of summer ends up looking noticeably worse by the time fall actually rolls around. It helps to think of August less as a quiet holdover from summer and more as the last real checkpoint before the calendar shifts into a much busier stretch of lawn work, since almost everything covered here either gets meaningfully harder to fix or completely impossible to fix once the season moves past it. A lawn that gets even most of this list handled properly heads into September already, ahead of where it would otherwise be, ready to take full advantage of the busier fall work instead of trying to catch up on August's leftover problems at the same time. Handle these few things now, and the lawn heading into fall looks a lot better than one that just coasted through August on autopilot. If you want the complete month-by-month plan for your specific lawn, covering exactly what to do and when so you are never just guessing, the ebook I wrote is linked in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen to grab it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.